Hey everybody, Daniel LeMay here. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Doing It with AI. Today we're going to be talking about Canvas apps, specifically Canvas apps with an Azure SQL backend, and how we can make those apps really performant by leveraging stored procedures to insert bulk data into tables and return that data back to the Canvas app in a view. And of course, we're going to be leveraging AI to help us write those stored procedures and the views. So stay tuned, this should be a really good one. So one of the things I get asked a lot in my job at Power Apps 911 is, how can I use Azure SQL in a way that's safe? I don't want people patching directly to my SQL tables. I don't even want to give them the access to do that through the SQL connectors and Canvas apps. So what are my other options? Well, the best approach to take here is to set up some DLP policies, apply them to a specific environment where your apps live, and those policies should be specific to Azure SQL connectors. And what you can do is you can go in there and very granularly say, I want to not allow any action in this connector except executing a stored procedure. And so what this is going to allow you to do is send data from your Canvas app through a stored procedure, have the stored procedure take that information, write it to the SQL tables, and that way you have a very narrow path to get your data into your SQL database. And what this does is it allows you to do additional validation on the data as well. So you can have SQL handle validation instead of coding all of that into your front end. Now, we're not going to talk about how to build those DLP policies today, but we are going to show how to build the flow, which will execute the stored procedure and then return a response back to the Canvas app. And we're also going to look at how to write that stored procedure using ChatGPT. So let's just jump right into it. Alright, so the first thing I want to show you here is just the schema of the SQL table we're going to be working with. It's really simple. We have an ID column, which is int. This is our primary key. It's an auto end column. And then we have three invarchar 255 columns, MAC, which is going to be MAC address, username, and IP address. And so this is the table that we're going to use our stored procedure to write data into, and that data is going to come out of our Canvas app. So now that you kind of understand the schema, I think the easiest thing to do is just head over to ChatGPT and tell it what we want. Okay, so here we are on ChatGPT, and I know what I need, so I'm just going to type it in here. I'm going to ask it if it can write a stored procedure. Can you write a stored procedure? Stored procedure should have a single column as its input. Now, that means that we just want one input parameter for the stored proc, and it's going to be the JSON payload that we're going to send it. The column will contain a JSON array with the following shape. And now I'm just going to define the shape of the array. So it's going to be MAC, which I'm going to write the word string, but it's actually going to be a MAC address that's coming through as a string. Username, also a string, and IP address, which is also a string. What I'm doing here, square brackets mean array, curly braces or brackets mean record. And so this is the shape of the JSON that's going to come in. It's going to be an array with many records inside that have those three columns. And then I'll say have the stored procedure parse the array and place each record in a table called IP log. That's the name of our table. I think I had an underscore though. It's in all caps. Let's do it like that. Whose schema is identical to the shape of the records in the JSON input. After the stored procedure has run, return a response that says records successfully stored. Alright, so once the stored proc takes that array and pushes the data into the table, then I want it to respond with a result set that I can then pass back to the Canvas app so that the Canvas app knows, okay, the data's in there, I should go ahead and refresh the view. So we're going to also have ChatGPT write us a view for this information so we don't have to directly query the IP log table. So let's just hit enter and see what it does. Okay, so it's working. Recognizes that it's T-SQL. JSON array input. Very good. All right, create procedure. So if you're not familiar with stored procedures, the idea here is it's basically like a little mini script that you can have it trigger on changes to tables. There's a million different ways you can kick off a stored procedure. We're going to use a manual method where we kick it off with Power Automate. Okay, and then it's explaining some stuff, right? How do you call the stored proc? We're not going to use this method, but it's even given us some examples of how we might define that JSON array input and execute the stored procedure. So this is really cool. All right, so up here's our stored procedure. Zoom in a little on that for you. And what I'm going to do is copy this, and I'm going to head back over to SSMS and do a little bit of work with this. All right, so here in SSMS, I'm going to start a new query. So if I want to take what ChatGPT just wrote for me and have SSMS produce the stored procedure, then I just need to make a query and just simply paste in what it wrote. So there's what it wrote for us. Now I need to look this through, right? Because there's a couple things I didn't tell ChatGPT. I didn't tell it that it was an invarchar data type, although it figured that out based on me putting in string values for those key value pairs. But one thing that's different is it's trying to display these things as 50, invarchar 50 fields. It's actually 255. I don't know if this will have any effect if we ran it as 50, but just to be safe, I know that I have these columns set as invarchar 255s, so I'm going to go ahead and change that. So the rest of this looks pretty good. IP log is the name of my table, as you can see over here. And so I think I'm good to go. Go ahead and execute this. All right, so maybe hard to see down here. Let me see if I can make this bigger for you. Commands completed successfully. Okay, very good. So then if we go over here on the left and we go down to programmability, notice we don't have anything here under our main stored procedures folder right now. So I'm going to just refresh that. And there it is, insert IP logs. That's the name of our stored proc. ChatGPT came up with that. I didn't tell it to name it that, but it's there. And so now we should be able to reference that stored procedure from a Power Automate action. All right, so here we are back over at the Power Apps Studio. And what I'm going to do is throw a couple controls on the screen, write a little bit of PowerFX code to capture some data, namely those 3 columns from our SQL table. And then we're going to pass that data as JSON over to a flow that we're going to build here as well. So let's just get started. So I need some text inputs. I'm going to put some labels on these. And then I want to add these to a collection. So I'm going to throw a button in. I'll change my labels real quick. This will be Mac. This will be username. And this will be IP address. Now keep in mind that, you know, the way I'm doing this is very simplistic. It's just to prove a point. It's not about building the most efficient way to get this data into SQL. There's a bunch of different ways we could have built this. I could have imported this data from somewhere else. Maybe I'm pulling it from a different data source like Dataverse or something like that. Who knows? But for this example, I'm just going to have some text input fields, manually type a couple things, save them in a collection, and then send that collection over to Power Automate. Throw a gallery on here so that we know kind of what we're about to send over to SQL. Now I'm going to write a quick expression which is going to capture this data. And we'll set the items property of this to be our col IPs collection. IP address, Mac, username, okay, that's fine. We can roll with that. So now I need some information. I like to use this website Mockaroo, which lets you generate fake data. And it'll generate it in a variety of ways, like CSV, it'll generate it as JSON, even as SQL. So it's pretty cool. If you want to like pre-populate a SQL table with a bunch of fake information and you had a schema in mind, you can define the schema here, tell it you want it in SQL format, and that's how it'll spit it out for you as a SQL query, T-SQL query that will just insert those rows. Very cool stuff. Check it out. It's Mockaroo is the name of the service. So what I'm going to do is I know I have Mac, I have username, and I have IP address. Now it doesn't really matter that I make those match. But what's cool about Mockaroo is that I can pick all these different kinds of predefined data. So I know for MAC address, I want MAC address. For username, I don't want just the first name, I want a full name. And for IP address, I want an IP address. Really useful stuff for testing. I can define how many rows I want. So in my case, I'm just going to start with 3 rows. And then I'm going to say that I want it as JSON, as an array. And then down here at the bottom, I could save the schema if I wanted to use it again sometime. I could download the data as a JSON file, or I can just hit preview, which I'm going to do in this case. And that gives me some information that I can then copy and paste back over in our Power App. So I'm going to do that real quick and kind of speed up the process for you like I've been doing since you guys already know how to do a lot of this. All right. Okay, so we've got 3 records in here, and these are the records we want to push off to Power Automate. So let's get started sending off our data. And we need to build a flow to do that. So I'm going to go over here to the Power Automate section, and I'm going to go to Create New Flow. And I'm just going to say Create from blank. Power Apps is my trigger. That's what I want. I'm going to do a compose action. And then I'm going to ask in Power Apps. And what I'm immediately going to do is copy that and wrap that in a JSON function, which is going to make sure that our flow understands that the input coming in from Power Apps is JSON. So the next thing we're going to do is add our execute a stored procedure. So I'm going to type in SQL here. I'm going to go to execute stored procedure v2. Pick my server and my database name. And then for my procedure, there it is, insert IP logs. So I'm going to pick that. And because we only have that one input parameter, the JSON array, that's what shows up. And I can put the outputs of my compose in there. Now, I don't need to have this compose here. If you watch my other videos, you know I like to do that just so I can kind of see what's happening in the flow. And then I'll go back later and I'll clean all of that stuff up that's not necessary and get the flow down as few actions as possible. But for this case, I just want to make sure that everything's coming through properly. I'm going to leave my compose there and then just use the outputs of that compose as the inputs of my JSON array. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, we set up that stored proc to send us back a response. ChatGPT set it up for us, rather. So what I want to do is run the flow one time, see what the result of that run looks like, and then if the response came back the way that we wanted, then we can set up the Power App to deal with that response. All right, so our flow is now connected to the app. So let's throw another button on here. And for this button, we'll just say push to SQL. And our onSelect property is going to be the flow execute a stored procedure dot run. And then the input is going to be the payload of our collection. So JSON and then col IPs. All right, so let's test this out and see what happens. Okay, I didn't get an error, which is a good sign. All right, so since I can't look at my flow runs from this interface, which, come on, Microsoft, that would be really nice. I'm going to just go over to this other tab that I've opened up, and we're going to take a look at that run that just happened. So if we look here, we sent over our payload. There's Katie's record. You can see that here. That's our JSON. It went into our stored procedure, and then we got a result back in our result sets, table 1, record successfully stored. Very cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a way to refresh data in the Power App, because remember, since we're not writing directly to SQL, we are going to have to refresh whatever data source we're using to display that table in the Power App if we are doing that. And in this case, we're going to want to do that because we want to see the changes reflected when we write a new record in. So I'm going to hit edit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to respond back to the Power App if I can find the action. And I'm going to add an output, a text output. I'm going to call it response. And I know that the result sets is returning a table. And I know that I want to get the first item out of that table because in our case, there's only ever going to be one item in there. So I'm not going to use this result sets result because that's actually going to be an array. But I am going to come over here to expression, type in first, and then go pick my dynamic content, which now it recognizes table 1. And I can click that, and that's going to give me what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and save the flow now. I'm going to come back to my Power App, and I'm going to refresh the flow in my app. So now, if I look at the Push to SQL button, if I come to the end of this expression and I hit put a period there, I see response as a parameter that I can access. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to say if the flow .run is successful, I'm going to do that by just checking to see if it's blank or not. If it's not blank, then I want to notify the user with the response. And actually, let's set this in a variable. Set var response. And we'll just say notify, and the message we want to give back is var response success. So I'll format that text to make that a little easier to look at. So what we did here was we took our flow.run. We are still going to invoke that, but this time we're going to get the response value back out of it. We're going to set that in a variable, and then we're going to check to see if that variable is blank or not when we press the button. If it is blank, we're not going to do anything, although we should, right? We should say, hey, the stored proc didn't run for some reason. But we're going to assume it's going to run, and if it's not blank, if our response is not blank, we're going to go ahead and notify with the response back from the stored procedure. So let's do a couple things here. Let's make a button to clear out our collection. I'm just going to use a clear function for that. And then what I think I'll do is go back over to Mockaroo and let it generate another data set for us. And I'll quickly copy these values over, and we'll add another IP record to our table. So that adds it to our collection by clicking save there, and then when I hit push to SQL, what we should see this time is a notification bar come across the top of the app, and if we do, then we'll know that it ran successfully. So I'm going to hit push to SQL, and there we go, result record successfully stored. Now I could drill down further into this and just get this record successfully stored string out, but I just wanted to do this to show you that you can get information back from the stored procedure and bring it back into your Power App. I've used this a ton for a bunch of different purposes, and a lot of times I'll even have the stored procedure do some data manipulation for me and return an entire array, and I'll grab that array back into the application and populate a collection with it. And maybe we'll show that in an upcoming video. But for today, we're just going to keep it simple because the concept here is, can ChatGPT write a stored procedure? And I think we've seen already that it can. Let's do something else at this point. Let's see if ChatGPT can write us a query that will create a view of the IP log table. I'm almost certain it's going to be able to, but let's give it a shot anyway. Let's go back over to ChatGPT. All right, and then let's just follow up here and say, can you create a view, SQL view, based on the IP log table in your well, not in my previous question. All right, look. It's going to create it. So it's explaining to me what a view is. It's a virtual table based on the result of a select statement. And here's an example of how you might create it. And it says this view will have the same columns and rows as the IP log table. You can then query this view just like you would a table, which is exactly what we're going to do in our Power App. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this code. And I'm going to go back over to SSMS. And I'm going to just paste this code in here in the same query window where we were creating our procedure in the first place. And I'm going to hit execute. Okay, so now I have a view called IP log view. So let's go back over to our Power App and see if that view has become available. So as opposed to directly adding the table to the app, I'm just going to add the view to the app. Of course, views from SQL are read-only. And there it is, IP log view. So I'm going to connect to that. Okay, so now I'm just going to put in another gallery. In fact, I'm going to copy the gallery that we're using up here and just paste in another version of that to drag down to the bottom. But on this one, let's kind of rearrange things a little bit. Make it a little smaller so we can see some more rows, because I'm going to point this one at the IP log view. And there we have all of the records that we've put in so far. So I'm going to make one final change to our push to SQL code here. Not only am I going to notify after the proc runs, but I'm also going to refresh the view. And we have to do this because we need to query the view again. We're not patching anything directly. The proc is doing the updating. So we need to refresh our data source in order to see the changes that we make. I think I'm going to also clear out the collection here as well. Clear col IPs and then refresh the view. All right, let's do one final test here. I'm going to clear that collection so we don't end up with duplicate data in there. And then I'm going to grab Mamie Hinkus and I'm going to put her in. Apologies to Mamie if this 1 in a trillion shot happens to be her true IP address. All right, so we've got her in there. She's not in our list right now. Let's go ahead and push this to SQL. Okay, we get our notification. Looks like the proc ran successfully. And if I scroll down here and we look into our SQL view, we can see Mamie we just put in. And that's just about going to do it for this video. I'm really happy that you joined me for this. Let's do a quick recap of what we've learned. First and foremost, ChatGPT can write stored procedures. So if you don't know about stored procedures or this is your first time hearing about them, go do a little homework. Watch some other YouTube videos, read some blogs. Stored procedures can really change your workflow when it comes to dealing with SQL. The other thing we learned is that Canvas apps have the ability to utilize stored procedures, not only to write data, but to read data back as well. So we can call that stored proc, have it do some work, and then return information, even entire arrays of information, which we can build collections out of. But that's all very powerful stuff. Again, you want to look into those DLP policies. We may even do a video on DLP policies. I'm not sure. But just the concept of being able to only allow users to access that execute a stored procedure action for the SQL connector is a really powerful concept in terms of security and in terms of control over what sort of data actually ends up in your SQL database. So I hope you learned something from this video. And if you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, like the video. And if you want to chat or you got any questions about the content from today's video, leave me a comment down below. Happy to talk to you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Doing It with AI.